Welcome! In this series of videos, we will look at software add-ons for the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today we will look again at the My Little Grid add-on to display custom grids in your Windows client application. In our last video on the My Little Grid control, we covered the software that ships with it. What we're going to do today is we're going to create a grid on a dialog. The My Little Grid control ships with an excellent help file which covers everything that the grid can do, and it can do a lot. We'll be demonstrating today the freeware version of the grid control, which although it has limitations, it's still quite flexible. The help file provides an excellent reference to the many features and functions that the My Little Grid can perform. What I've prepared here is a small program with a basic dialog. Two buttons, one for actions on the grid, one to exit, and we're going to place our grid right in the middle of the dialog. So what I've done so far is I have added a custom library, which we'll come back to. This will contain some macros and functions to make life a little easier for you. And here I've included two items. One constant, which is used when the grid is created, and one handle which is used thereafter for referencing the grid and its functions. If we have a look at the dialog itself, it's a fairly standard dialog, and we're going to put our code in here to initialize and set up our grid. The very first thing you need to do is to call one routine within the library itself. The first thing we need to do is to initialize the grid. Having done so, we can then add the control to the dialog. This control add statement may look a little daunting at first, but we'll go through it one bit at a time. We're adding My Little Grid. Naturally, the next two parameters are the dialog handle and the constant for the grid itself. The string that follows is a configuration string, which we'll cover shortly. This basically tells the grid how many rows it should be set up with, how many columns, and a number of other options. It's then followed by the location on the dialog, then the width and the height of our grid control. If we run this now, you would see our grid appears on the screen. Now by default we have not yet named any of the columns or put any data into the grid, but the grid itself is there and it's functional. So how do we add a little more to our grid? Well, the first thing to do is to get the handle. And having got the Windows handle of the object, this is what we'll be using to perform functions on the grid itself. Now if we look at the grid again, we'll see that it looks like a fairly standard grid, but we want to put a tab at the bottom. The grid supports multiple tabs, so we'll set one up by default. And a nice easy way to do that is to use one of our library functions. If we have a look in our libraries, this is our new library. So the one I'm going to be using is this set tab width. One of the messages you can actually send is this to the grid control, which is basically used to set the amount of space on the bottom part of the grid that the tab is actually going to take up. So if we just paste this straight in, and we will put in a size of, say, 200. If we run that now, we will see that we now have a tab at the bottom of the grid with standard navigation buttons and the name of the tab. So that's our first addition to the grid with a single line of code. Now if we want to rename this to something other than sheet 1 to make it a bit more specific, we have another function we can use, rename tab. This basically takes in three parameters: the grid handle, the tab position, because naturally you can have multiple tabs, As we don't have a tab yet, the first one is going to be tab number 1. And finally, the name you want placed on the tab. And then a send message command is used to send the new name of the tab towards the grid control. So if we just paste this code in now, setting our 3 parameters being our grid handle, our tab position, which is tab 1 since this is the first tab, and the name we want set on the tab. So we run this now, we now have a named tab. So when setting up the grid, the configuration line can be used to set the number of rows in the grid, the number of columns, and a number of other specific things for the grid. These are all visible inside the help file, but an easy way of actually seeing them all is to put in what the letters are for configuration. The F is for the font, in this case the 3rd font. The S is for the size of the font. We have the Z option to allow us to create an array to hold individual cell formatting, which we'll cover in our next video. The B option is for block selection, either so you can select rows or columns, or rows and columns, depending on your need for the grid. The first parameter here is the column width. In this case we're setting the very first column to be 20 pixels wide. We can quite easily change that to 40, which if we run that now you'll see the first column is now 40 wide. If you don't specify the other columns, it assumes 100. The A setting is for the row numbering. If we set A to 1, we will get arrows in the very first config column. If we set it to 0, we will have numbered columns. We'll leave it at 2 for the moment. And we'll leave the first column as 20. So having named our tab, our next task is to put the headers in for the columns. So now we're setting the column headings. The MLG put command can quite successfully be used to put data into any cell on the grid control, including the headings. It takes 4 parameters: the grid, the row, the column, and the data you want to put in. The final parameter is a parameter used to tell the grid control whether you should refresh the cell immediately after the command or not. If long refresh is 0, there will be no refresh. If long refresh is 1, it will be refreshed. Now we use a simple for next loop, accessing the MLG put command to put the day name into each column heading, in this case the days of the week. And then finally, having done all that, we're going to use another macro, the grid refresh command, to send a message to the grid to tell it to refresh. And as we'll see, the column headings are now successfully appearing on each of the day columns. Now we can put data into the rows in the first column by using the MLG put command again. Now you'll notice the data here is all left-centered. Putting data into a row is automatically left-centered unless you tell the grid otherwise, whereas the headings are centered in the column headings. Now, having put all that data in, we'll want to configure it. But you can see from the control that everything is editable, including the time slot column. Now we want to set the grid up so that the time slot column is not editable. So in order to do that, we'll set some variables up. To specify the column, the justification of the data, whether the column is going to be locked or not, and we're not going to be using the color one today, but it's part of the parameter list. So we're setting column to be column number 1, the justification to use a constant, which is justification for centered on the column. The column lock is using a column lock constant, and the color will leave as 0 for the moment. We're calling the subroutine that comes with the library to format the column number. Passing the grid, the column, null, the justification setting, the color, and whether the column's to be locked or not. We'll cover these extra columns in more detail in the next video. But if we try running that now, we'll see that successfully the first column is actually now centered. You can click on the column cell, but it will not allow you to edit it. So effectively that first column is now locked. And all remaining columns are still usable by the user. So if we have a look at our event handler into our callback control, we set a local temp variable up in there to be used so we can pull information back from the grid. Having put information in, we now want to pull information out of the grid. So we have an event handler for the grid action button, so when the button is pressed, we can actually pull information out. So what we're going to do here is we're going to populate the strtemp variable using the MLG get function, which takes parameters which are the grid pointer, the row number, and the column number. So we're looking to pull back row number 1, column number 2. And we'll display this in a message box. So if we put some data into that column, and then hit the grid action button, it pulls the text out. So any text put into any cell you can extract quite easily using the MLG get function. You can also, as with all grids, you can widen or narrow the columns quite happily. You can widen or narrow the rows quite happily. And there is a splitter bar you can use to actually split the spreadsheet into two, allowing you to scroll independently to the right or the left. We'll just comment this one out. And we'll go back into our utilities again. And what we're going to do here, we're going to use it to clear our grid. So sending a message to the grid to say clear grid will remove all text from all cells of the grid except the headers. And after that we're going to do a refresh so that the grid gets refreshed and displays with no data in it. So if we run this now, put some data into some of the cells, and then hit the grid action button, the grid is cleared. Very quick way of clearing out your grid. So in the next video we'll cover some more configuration of our grid, putting checkboxes, drop-down lists, and some colour into the grid. But that's it for today. Thank you for watching.